If you're like me and have played more League of Legends than you care to admit, this is a cycle you've probably seen before. A new champion is released, people seem to only focus on how broken or useless they are, and also care way too much about the first day's win rates when no one actually knows how to properly play or build on them. But the thing is, this reaction that we're so used to now hasn't always been the case, even if it sometimes feels that way. So why? Why do we dread new champions being added now when back in the day people used to actually look forward to getting them? With a roster of 40 champions by the game's official release, League still had a lot of growing to do in terms of champion diversity and variety, especially considering that many of these original champions held similar identities due to assigned roles not really being as established as they are today. You see, in the early days of League, the game's conventional role setup wasn't as fixed in place as it currently is nowadays, since the game itself still had a lot of, well, kind of everything to be figured out, meaning that champions were not necessarily designed for a specific role's playstyle since there weren't exactly established roles to build a structure around, instead being made more so as specific class types that could be played wherever the player would like, with some of course doing better in some positions compared to others. For example, think of all the champions that were originally released as more or less glorified auto attackers, champs like Old Gangplank or the infamous Old Scion that were eventually reworked to have more specific and intentional identities instead of having this very generic playstyle, and we'll talk more about Riot's approach to reworks in just a moment. In the meantime, it didn't take long for the original roster of 40 champions to begin growing in size, since even just a little over a month after the game's launch, Riot began to expand League's roster with more unique characters to open up different playstyles, such as Udyr being a champion with 4 basic abilities, and Nidalee being the game's first form-swapping champ, adding a new champion every couple of weeks for the first 3 or 4 years, with many of these champions being designed under class-specific constraints as opposed to having a specific lane role being their main priority. Now, it's worth mentioning that even outside of the structure and balance of standardized lanes, the balance of standardized champion classes was and still is an incredibly important part of maintaining a healthy game, since it provides areas of inherently balanced strengths and weaknesses that fall under clear classified identities, kind of like a big game of rock, paper, scissors. And though some champions do fall under the categorization of 2 classes as opposed to just 1, there are classes that are okay to be mixed as long as it's not in a way that breaks the importance of class boundaries. Basically, the early years of League had a clear structure to creating champions that were within reasonable gameplay limitations even without worrying about the structure that would eventually be provided by set roles. But probably the most important part about these releases is that these champions were designed with a clear purpose in mind, even if their purpose was sometimes a little niche. And this emphasis on making champions with a clear purpose in mind would not only be the case for new releases, but it would also turn out to be the rule of thumb when it came to champions eventually getting reworked as well. As we talked about a few moments ago, since many of League's oldest champions were designed for a less structured organization of how League was played, understandably they were eventually reworked to try and give them a clearer identity as to how they should be played under this more structured game, making their very generalized kits more intentional, while new champion releases also filled their own niches as well. For example, Bard was introduced as a support who is rewarded for focusing on lanes outside of just bot lane, and Jhin was a marksman who traded attack speed for slower but more powerful shots. Champions released during this time bent the rules of their class creatively, but didn't just outright break them. And while sure, they weren't always perfect, they were designed under the constraints of how the game is played and how champion classes are supposed to function. Well, that is until around the release of Pyke. Now, depending on who you ask, different people will pinpoint the growing problems of League's modern champion design with different releases, which makes sense as new champions are designed to each have their own unique twist, with some going further than others. As for myself, I feel Pyke's release is the first truly major overstep in the balance of champion classes since he was released as an assassin support, which on paper are contradictory roles. Assassins are more or less designed to make the game warp around them as a high damage carry, whereas the role of a support is to pretty much do the exact opposite, meaning that Pyke's existence in the support role to even begin with fundamentally requires a shifting of how a team is meant to be structured. And while I still think he's a really cool champ thematically and is actually one of my most played champions despite me being a devout top laner, I just cannot deny the fact that his purpose is to no longer fit into the structure of the game, but rather to restructure the game around him. Plus, the champions that followed Pyke's release also began to grow problematic by design as well, with Sylas and Yuumi really needing no introduction to being incredibly game-changing in how they're meant to be played. And it's around this time that we also began to see a shift in what I would consider to be League's current champion philosophy, which focuses less on game balance or game health, and more so on what is the gimmick that we can give to this champion, with said gimmicks making this ever-growing pool of champions even harder to balance. With that all said, one critique I'd like to make on how the League community handles new releases is that there seems to be a heavy narrative bias on the way that basically any new champions are introduced, and let me give you an example of kind of what I mean by this. Say a new champion is introduced that can easily deal over 1000 true damage on their ultimate, has armor shred plus built-in tenacity, and also passively heals for a massive amount of their health, while also stacking armor and MR as the game progresses. People would call this champion broken, but I would call this champion Garen. Look, I do believe that modern champions have trended in a way that is increasingly more problematic, but acting as if every release is the end of the world doesn't really help with giving genuine critique. I mean, imagine the response of a champion like Yasuo was released today. Even though things definitely haven't been trending in a direction that I believe to be healthy, it would be unfair to say that every new champion the past few years has been inherently problematic just because it's harder to make balanced or sustainable ideas. Champions such as Milio, Renata, or Vex in my opinion have largely been fine additions that are refreshing yet not overpowering, with Vex especially being a great concept niche to combat the game's mobility creep issue as well. However, those are just 3 of the last 20 champions who haven't been either problematic or just kind of forgotten in some capacity, and while many of League's most recent additions to the roster have bent the structure of game design to varying extents, for the sake of time, there are 2 champions that I especially want to highlight that just do not fundamentally work as concepts, and it shouldn't come as a surprise to hear that these are Cassante and Akshan. Remember how earlier we talked about the blending of champion classes needing to be treated with care so that it could maintain this kind of class rock paper scissors? Well, these 2 are essentially releases that are built on the basis of being scissors combined with rock and scissors combined with paper, which you can't just get both sides without having some massive problems. The weakness of a marksman is that they lack the mobility of an assassin, unless you know they're an assassin as well. And similarly, the weakness of a tank is their lack of damage, unless max HP true damage was part of their passive. Now, look, I could probably make dedicated videos to each of these champions just due to the large extent of each of their flaws. But as it relates to this video's topic of League's current champion problem, it shows the issues that arise when a concept or gimmick is made first, with the boundaries that should instead be the focus being applied later, as a top laner can be a skirmisher or a warden, but not necessarily both at the same time. So with all that said, if adding new champions is becoming increasingly problematic, but the game still needs to be kept fresh, it's a fair question to wonder how this problem is supposed to be resolved. And to that, I present one of the community's most beloved types of updates, reworks, and not just promising to do them, but actually investing heavily in doing so. You see, reworks more often fix a problem instead of adding another one to worry about, and at the very least, it will breathe some much needed life into an outdated champion through modernizing their gameplay, giving them a clearer identity, and of course just making them look better. This might be a bit of a hot take, I'm not entirely sure, but I would rather Riot take a year or 2 just to rework and update the champions that need it most, as opposed to creating more champions on top of the 170 we already have. Heck, even a game like Smash Melee has only ever had a roster of 25 characters on a game that was released in 2001 without any new additions, and people still love playing and exploring the possibilities of their favorite mains. I get that Melee and League are obviously different games, so I'm just saying this to give an example that adding new champions isn't necessarily a requirement for a game to be continuously developed and changed. With that in mind, here's a personal list of champions that I would say are worthy of a full-on rework, and here are a few more that at the very least could use a serious visual update. And please let me know your personal list down in the comments as well, since I'm curious to hear y'all's thoughts on this too. But while full-on visual and gameplay updates on champions is something that Riot has done before through community voting, it takes them an absurd amount of time to even deliver a single one, especially compared to the amount of new champions that have been released during these time periods. Since literally 2022, Riot has openly teased the possibility of a rework for Shyvana, and at the very earliest, this will be finally coming in 2026, after the most recent rework of Skarner took over 2 years to complete. It's just frustrating that reworks seem to be getting less and less priority from Riot when League's champion pool needs it now more than ever. And it's also frustrating that the reason behind this lack of reworks is often due to the lack of profit that they bring in on new skins or the hype of a completely new champion, especially since, as I've covered previously, Riot has already been really hurting in the public opinion when it comes to farming their player base for money. I get that Riot is ultimately a company that is designed to make money at the end of the day to even keep the servers up in the first place, however I can't help but be irked when lots of promises of reworks and much needed updates are made and then just not followed through on. I don't think it's fair to expect the game to just run off of voluntary care and passion projects, but I do believe it makes sense to want it to run on balance and substance, something that I see reworks as crucial to providing. To me, League's champion problem is leaving old issues unfixed while continuing to add new ones, and I'm not exactly thrilled about the future release of the next K'Sante or Akshan in the years to come. Once again, please let me know any of your thoughts on anything I mentioned in this video, and if you did enjoy the video, feel free to subscribe as well. Love to have you, and turning on the bell notification as well would help me out a lot. So yeah, with that all being said, hope you guys have a great rest of your day or night. As always, I'll catch you in the next video. Later!